Thanks, Can. Just to say that I also met the film workers on a number of occasions. I'd like to support Deputy Boyd Barrett's comments here this morning. As you know, Minister, a few weeks ago the World Wildlife Fund it was carried out actually by the Zoological Society of Ireland. They published their 2018 Living Planet Index, which showed, in fact, that the animal populations on the planet had reduced by something like 60% since 1970, and this has been, talked about as something like the sixth mass extinction. The World Wildlife Fund is asking, in fact, that we would begin to treat this matter in the same way as we do, obviously, climate change, and that we would have some kind of an agreement like the Paris climate change, but on animals and on biodiversity.
Minister.
Thank you. My department is aware of the recent Living Planet report, which you referred to in your question, which is the latest to highlight global declines in biodiversity in very stark terms. And I'm very concerned about any decline in species, as well as any loss of habitats, Deputy, around the world. Biodiversity loss is an enormous challenge that requires a very serious concerted response from the global community. And the UN Convention on Biological Diversity is the key international agreement underpinning international cooperation on biodiversity, and as noted in the Living Planet report, is the appropriate body for such a global agreement. And my department will be represented at the Conference of the Parties, which will take place in Egypt later this month. And the main work of this Conference of the Parties is to achieve the groundwork for the post-2020 framework for tackling biodiversity loss, and this has been the subject of lengthy discussions between the EU member states during the year. And in addition to the overarching framework of this, there are a number of targeted agreements that Ireland and our colleagues across the EU actively participate in, with the view to meeting the challenges presented by the loss of species and habitats around the world, and indeed the wildlife. And these agreements include the Convention on the International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Flora and Fauna, which is CITES, and the CITES agreement is instrumental in tackling on a global level the continued threat posed by illicit trade to vulnerable and endangered species, including rhinos, elephants, sharks and rosewood. And it should also be noted that protecting species also helps preserve the habitats that they live in for future generations. And the 18th Conference of the Parties for CITES will take place next year in Sri Lanka. EU member states, including Ireland, are beginning preparations so that a strong and coherent pro-conservation position can be presented at the conference negotiations on behalf of the EU and its member states.
Minister, the balance of the reply will be included in the official record. Deputy Broughan.
As you know, this was a widespread study, I think, of 4,000 vertebrate species, including over 18,000 populations of mammals, reptiles, amphibians, birds and fish. I think the director of the World Wildlife Fund, Mike Barrett, said we're kind of facing a cliff in this regard, and that's why the comparison was made, I think, with the Paris Climate Change Accord, that this is as dangerous for, indeed, our own survival and the planet's survival as climate change, and that, because ecosystems rely on each other. So you mentioned obviously the UN Convention and the 2020 meeting and so on, but would you be interested in pushing forward for a comparable accord to the Paris climate change in relation to this matter, and given, of course, that we've had something, as I've said, 60% of mammals on Earth have been wiped out since 1970, and we're facing, our forest and river habitats are facing depletion.
Yeah, I can assure the Deputy that we take this matter very seriously. Ireland's third National Biodiversity Action Plan sets out actions to which a range of government, civil and private sectors will undertake to achieve our vision for biodiversity. And it's really important that we do that. And we have 250,000 was allocated in 2018 to support, for example, local authority biodiversity projects. We also had an additional 150,000 that was allocated to support tackling invasive alien species in their areas. And there's also many targeted actions which contribute towards our obligations under EU international directives and other relevant national policies, including the National Peatland Strategy and the Climate Change Adaptation Framework. And I'll be hosting a major conference next year with Irish stakeholders in biodiversity in February. I'll be announcing the very first Biodiversity in the Community Awards because I do think it has to start at a local level before we even reach out to the global level. And I'll also, Ceann Comhairle, just to finish, be launching the 21 Seeds programme, which is an initiative of agreed actions by all stakeholders. And we also have the programme called Bog Life, which I was speaking about earlier on, Deputy.
Deputy Broughan.
Thanks. Well, we tend to think, obviously, Minister, of Asia and palm oil deforestation and Latin America with the expansion of soya, and the fears that many people have for the new Brazilian president in that regard. But also, obviously, we live, fortunately, on what the government has, and I would commend you for that, on the Dublin Bay biosphere. But in my own constituency, for example, there's grave fears in relation to the future of the Howth Peninsula, which is Howth Castle. It's reportedly to be sold, and there's concern that the Howth Peninsula, which has been such a fantastic green lung for Howth, that it could be under threat as well. And it's your own department, I think, that can confer, I think, national park status on endangered wildlife areas. And I wondered if this is something that you might be interested in supporting, down the line in relation to Howth, because year in, year out, that part of my constituency, we have something like 1 million visitors. Everybody who comes to the city virtually is told it's a wonderful place to go to look at our country, and also to explore the green areas, the wildlife and so on. If this is a national park status for Howth, maybe is perhaps the way we need to go in this regard, closer to home.
Deputy, we're always interested in my department in looking at submissions from members of the Oireachtas, and Howth may well be something that we could look at. We already, as you know, have 6 national parks covering 88,000 hectares. We have 78 national reserves. We have 280 national monuments. Obviously, there's a balance between conservation and extending that. But suffice to say, and I appreciate your comments that that we are doing everything we can, this department, in relation to looking and working with the new Minister for Broughan in relation to climate action across government, but also biodiversity. And there's also a draft sectoral climate change adaptation plan for biodiversity, which has been drawn up by the scientific staff at the National Parks and Wildlife Service. And this was circulated to the NPWS recently. And we're also having a stakeholder workshop, and that was held in October, to discuss and refine elements of the plan, because I think what you say is very important. I think we have to make sure that we look after our ecosystems and our habitats for future generations. As Mary Robinson said, if we don't deal with it in this generation, there won't be another one.